Abby, I love the question that you posed over whether markets, how queasy they should be about the fundamental outlook. You know, we've talked about the strength of the job market, but as Tom was pointing to, you've done some really important work on the underlying picture of the job market in the US. How queasy should Chairman Powell be about that?
I think we should all be concerned about it as citizens. There's always been differences between large urban cities, small cities, and rural areas. And our work, which we looked at every county in the United States, shows that this gap has widened dramatically since the financial crisis and the recession which followed. So, for example, we have seen job growth of about 14% in the nation's largest cities over this period of time. But rural and small cities, job growth has been less than 3%. There's also been a very significant widening in average wages in workers. So, for example, per capita median income in prime cities in the United States, most recently 2017, about $60,000 per annum. In rural areas, only $38,000 per annum. So I think that we also, therefore, needed to look, as we did, at some of the other underlying factors. And one of the things we discovered, of course, is that the average resident in a large city is better educated, much more likely to have a college degree by about 10 percentage points than people who live in rural areas. We also know that those populations are more diverse. About 30% of the population in our largest cities are foreign-born. In rural areas and small cities, it's notably under 5%. So we're seeing significant international migration at upper-scale jobs into the large cities.
Let me frame this correctly, Abby, and I'm sure you didn't do this in your exceptionally important paper at Goldman Sachs. The divide here, folks, is 2.7%, as Naira mentioned, in rural growth versus a ginormous double-digit return in the urban growth. The distance of this, Abby Joseph Cohen, is not just from the Dakotas or Kansas or whatever to New York City or Washington. It's the distance from Martin Van Buren High School in Queens, New York, over to the storied halls of Goldman Sachs. You did that. How do we get back to where Abby Joseph can move forward like you did decades ago?
I think that you are raising perhaps one of the most interesting points from a policy perspective because it's underappreciated. One of the things that our work showed is that there are enormous differences in educational attainment, but also industrial composition. And I want to go back to the success of New York City over the last 10 years. Why lots of people like to point to the enormous growth in high-tech jobs in high-level medical research, and so on. The fastest job growth in the city of New York has actually been at the lower end of the wage scale. Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor, took over just a few weeks after 9/11, and he recognized that there were people in our city who were being left behind. And there was an analysis done in terms of how could jobs be created, how could opportunities be created for people in those categories. And we have seen enormous growth in things like tourist trade. We had 63 million tourists, which means demand for hotels, demands for restaurants. We've seen enormous growth in people coming even from the New York metro area into the city. This creates jobs for people at the lower end of the education scale and wage scale.
This is fine, and I'm going to disclaim that the 108th mayor of New York also is a member of this television and radio network, Michael Bloomberg.